Very, very warm welcome to those who are joining this joint event between the British-German Association and the International Association for the Study of German Politics. And sorry, we're starting just a couple of moments late. My name's Ed Turner. I work at Aston University in Birmingham, and I'm lucky enough to chair the International Association for the Study of German Politics at the moment. But I'm simply a moderator here. We've got two real experts on this call who will be talking us through the current situation, I suppose, with the rise of right-wing populism in Germany and beyond. And I think we're going to have a fantastic discussion. So we're going to be kicking off with contributions from Professor Jonathan Olsen from Texas Women's University. John's published really widely on these topics and is also one of the USA's leading soothsayers on all things German. Great to have you with us. We're also joined by Professor Petra Schleiter, Professor of Politics at Oxford University and is also a fellow of St Hilda's College in Oxford. Petra is an expert on German politics, but also on comparative politics and the comparative politics of this part of the political spectrum. So it's very good to have you both with us. John, I think, and just a couple of words about housekeeping. There's a Q&A box here. If a question comes into your mind, please don't be shy. Just tap it in. I will try and collate questions as best I can. And then fire them at presenters. We may be able to open things up for discussion more widely, but we'll see how we go. But do please use the Q&A box. Secondly, this is currently being recorded. We might stop the recording if either of the speakers thinks we're getting into sensitive terrain and it's better not to be recorded. But as things stand, it will be recorded, so that should be good. And a few people have said they can't be here tonight, but are interested in the recording. So that's great. And thirdly, we will finish on time. It's always better to leave the stage when the audience is clamoring for more rather than with people sneaking out the back of the room, whether virtual or real. So that's what we'll do. So once again, big thanks to the British German Association for setting it up. Above all, big thanks to John and Petra for being with us tonight. And John, if you're happy to share your own screen, does that work on this?
Sure.
And you've got a couple of slides, I think, as well. And over to you.
Thanks so much, Ed. I appreciate it. Let's see. Can everybody see those slides? Can you see that, Ed?
We can see those beautifully. Go to full screen if you want, but it doesn't really matter. Just go for it.
I don't know if we can go full screen. Let me not worry about doing the technology. Well, thanks very much for having me here today. I really appreciate it. What I'm going to do in my 10 minutes or so is just kind of set some broad background for the AFD, talk just a tiny bit about the history. If we look at the history of the AFD through various elections from 2013 up to the present day, look a little bit about who's voting for the AFD, what we know about voters for the AFD, and then finally a little bit of speculation on some upcoming elections in Germany and how the AFD might fare. And then I'll turn it over to Petra after that. Okay, so let's see. There we go. So this slide basically illustrates three different elections up until the 2021 election. So it's 2013 election, 2017 election, and 2021 election. And this is what I'm basically calling the developmental stages in voters for the AFD. This framework comes from a book that Michael Hansen and I put out in 2024 on the AFD, where we looked at basically who the AFD was attracting through these different elections and why they were resonating so strongly. And as we'll see, the AFD's just gotten stronger and stronger over the last decade. So starting out with 2013, this is what we call the emergence stage. And as I think is well known, the AFD emerged as an anti-EU or EU skeptic party trying to take advantage of the financial crisis, and especially, of course, in Germany, the bailouts, which were quite controversial. So it was at that time a what I'd call a moderate, a conservative, maybe right conservative party, but wasn't particularly extreme. If you look at its ideological positions towards immigration or economics, and we looked at the voter behavior, they were not predictors of the AFD vote. What was a predictor of the AFD vote was its view on bailouts. And what we argue in the book, basically, the subtitle of the book is "The Populist Far Right Alternative for Germany." So it's basically they are a populist entrepreneur trying to find the issues that other parties, mainstream parties, are either altogether on or have neglected, and they're finding these niches all the way through their existence. In 2013, it was the Eurozone crisis, where they positioned themselves to outside of the mainstream consensus on this. At that time, they had no consistent socio-demographic profile. They were slightly more popular in the East than in the West, so that's continued up to the present day. But as we know, they had a strong showing, but they narrowly missed coming into the Bundestag, so they didn't surmount the 5% hurdle. Then a lot went on between 2013 and 2017, especially around 2015 or so was when we had the migration crisis, the European migration crisis, and Merkel's policies, which Alexander Gauland, one of the leaders of the AFD, called a gift to the party. So as that policy unfolded, the AFD again positioned itself outside the mainstream consensus of all the other parties and became more like populist far-right parties elsewhere in Europe. So we found in 2017 that voters, the anti-immigrant sentiment was the strongest predictor of the AFD vote by far. We found a couple of other things that were predictors of the vote: dissatisfaction with democracy, which I think Petra is going to talk about a little bit. Dissatisfaction with democracy, dissatisfaction with the mainstream parties. There was surprisingly no consistent socio-demographic profile of these voters, except for lower levels of education and then this gender gap. So men voting more strongly for the AFD than women. Also in this election, it did much better in the East, around 21%, than in the West. So this is where we really see this gap between the East and West, which of course started to narrow a little bit in the 2025 election, but still that is still a very significant characteristic of the AFD, that it does much better in the East than it does in the West. So this is what we call the breakthrough stage. It gets representation in the Bundestag. It fully transforms, or is on its way to transforming, into a far-right populist party. Then in 2021 election, which is of course majorly impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, the AFD lost vote shares in that election, but interestingly enough, it held its own in Eastern Germany. So sometimes the story that came out of 2021 was that the AFD pursued the wrong strategy and they lost votes because of that. But we argue basically that it held on to its core clientele of voters, especially in the East, by positioning itself again outside the mainstream consensus on how to handle the COVID-19 crisis and the government measures that were associated with that. Again, far-right ideology, dissatisfaction with democracy, anti-immigrant sentiment were predictors of the vote. And again, no consistent socio-demographic profile except for these lower levels of education and a gender gap. Okay, so this is the sustainment stage. The AFD has gotten through 2 elections with a good representation in the parliament, even though they went down in the vote. Okay, so if we look at this graphically over the last dozen years for federal elections, same thing for state elections, we can see how the AFD has gradually increased its vote more and more until we get to 2025, when it goes over 20% of the vote. I could talk about the 2025 election in just a second. In state elections, again, you see this East-West divide very graphically illustrated. So we have eastern states such as Thuringia, Brandenburg, Saxony, where the AfD is getting close to or over 30% of the vote. If we look at opinion polls going into state elections this year, I'll put up a graph on that in just a second, you can see that the AfD is around 40%. All right, so it continues to increase its strength in Eastern Germany. All right, the federal election of 2025 made much more significant inroad into Western Germany than in previous national elections. So it's getting much higher vote totals in Western states, in the old states of Germany. Still, there is a gap, of course, between East and West, but the AfD is making significant inroads into the West in Western state elections. It gained former voters from the Union parties, from the FDP, from the SPD. It lost some voters, but only a tiny fraction to this new BSW party, Sarah Wagenknecht, but not as many as some analysts had predicted. So the BSW was predicted to hurt the AfD, and it really didn't. Okay, dissatisfaction with Merz as chancellor candidate and disillusionment with the Union led a number of former voters to turn to the AfD. So it's becoming something of a catch-all party, appealing to lots of different voter groups and lots of different constituencies, still more true in the East than in the West. Nevertheless, as recent scholarship has shown, AfD voters are increasingly loyal to the party. That's something that's I found fascinating, is that you're not having that many defections from AfD voters to other parties. So instead of like a protest vote where voters would shift back and forth, try to register their protest with a party outside the mainstream, and then return to the fold later, the AfD has increasingly a loyal constituency of voters. Okay, just an illustration of the East-West divide here. This is the percentage of second ballot votes in the last election. And as you see, all the blue, that's the AfD compared to 2021. Okay, so that brings us then to the state elections in 2026 that are coming up. So I've got this as a question. The AfD as the big winner, well, it remains to be seen, but you see there's 5 important state elections coming up in 2026. We have Baden-Württemberg, we've got Rhineland-Pfalz, we've got Berlin, Saxony-Anhalt, and Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. So the big ones to keep in mind, of course, are I think the big ones that should be on our radar are these eastern state elections, where, as I said, we've got the AfD polling around 40%. 40% in Saxony-Anhalt and 38% in Mecklenburg, all right? But still, these totals in the western states are, they're significant. 21% is where it's polling now in Baden-Württemberg, 19% in Rhineland-Pfalz. And then in Berlin, kind of a mixed east-west constituency, it's got about 17% of the vote. Okay, final slide. I don't know how I'm doing on time, Ed, but I'm trying to keep it down to 10 minutes. So, forecasting ahead, what are we looking at for the AfD? Well, again, another question mark. Is this a new stage that the AfD is entering? We've had the breakthrough stage. We've had the sustainment stage. So, a new stage that Michael and I talk about in our book is, well, is there an ascendancy stage in line for the AfD? And what would that mean? Well, basically more of a normalization of the AfD, and that would mean the end of the firewall, okay? A coalition with the AfD at some level. It would also, of course, mean an even greater expansion of its support base across social groups and regions, especially Western Germany. Further sharpening of its messages it tries to get into new policy areas where so far it hasn't shown much competence, and the voters it hasn't been too important to their voters, but they would demand it if the AfD was to take part in government. Now, I think this is unlikely still at this moment because the union is still firmly against it, or I think it could split the union. So those within the union who might support working with the AFD on a case-by-case level, that would probably be the farthest they would go, but would not want to have an outright coalition with the AFD, and then some union voters and some union supporters who would be steadfast against working with the AFD. And the second important point is voters are still overwhelmingly reject the AFD as a governing partner at the federal level, different in the states, of course, but still overwhelmingly reject the AFD as a governing partner at the federal levels. They could punish the union if the union decides to go into coalition with the AFD. However, even though it's unlikely, it's not impossible. And we've seen some very unlikely things happen in the course of German politics over the last 5 to 10 years, but especially, I think, as normal coalitions are made much more difficult by the math, basically. It's by the AFD share of the vote and the seats. So if we look at the big state elections in the East in 2026, so Saxony-Anhalt and Mecklenburg, if the AFD gets 40% of the vote, then it's going to be hard to build a coalition around it. It's going to be a very strange coalition that you'd have to do a workaround for. On the other hand, the AFD, it's possible they could get an absolute majority of the seats. If they win 45, 46% of the vote, they could get an absolute majority. They would not have to worry about a coalition partner. Now, interestingly enough, and I heard this on another analysis, the AFD may not want to win the absolute majority because that really doesn't break the firewall. All the other parties would still be against it. However, if it's in a position of strength with 40+% of the vote, they can make the argument that it is undemocratic to shut them out of coalition government. So that's where we stand right now, early 2026, and we'll see what happens the rest of the year. Thanks so much.
John, thanks ever so much for such a succinct and rich presentation. And my goodness, it just brought home to me, and I think to many of us, just how much the sand has shifted in German politics in a time that many of us have been following it. So thank you very much indeed. I think there was already a really interesting question in the chat. But let's turn first to Petra, if we may, to pick up the conversation, and then we'll open it for discussion and some questions after that. Petra, over to you. You're still on mute, sorry.
Classic. Well, thank you so much, Ed. And it's such a pleasure to be part of this discussion on right-wing populism in Germany and the UK. And fascinating, Jonathan, to look at your slides and listen to you speaking. So I probably want to broaden our lens a little bit. And because what Jonathan is describing is not specific to Germany. So across Europe, radical right parties have moved from the margins to the center of political competition, reshaping political agendas, party systems, and also democratic risk. So I'm a comparative political scientist, and I want to place that rise of the radical right in a broader context by starting from a deeper problem, which is the crisis of mainstream democratic parties, which has created the space for the radical right challengers to thrive. So mainstream democratic parties are essentially the cornerstones of democracy. They organize electoral competition, they provide vehicles for governance, they act as agents of accountability. But at the same time, these parties are in a really deep crisis. And that's the flip side of what Jonathan has described. So they have faced a steady decline in membership, in vote share, and in public trust. So party membership across Europe has fallen to historic lows, often below 5% of the electorate. And the outcome is a really weakened link between citizens and those politicians and parties that are meant to represent them. And this has created a legitimacy deficit that goes to the very foundations of representative democracy. So why is this happening? Well, there are two trends that have coincided. The first one focuses on voters, and the other one is a change that's happened with parties. So let's turn to voters first. voters have become more critical, less deferential citizens. We all have greater education, more media exposure, more access to information than previous generations. And the days when we would have inherited our party loyalty from our parents and voted accordingly for the rest of our lives are over. So that's weakened traditional party loyalties, it's fueled electoral volatility, and issues like climate change or migration or inequality, they cause us to make up our minds and they drive shifting allegiances. And many citizens, especially younger ones, actually feel so ill-served by parties now that they engage politically through protests, through NGOs or online movements, and certainly not through party membership. The second thing that's changed is parties themselves. They've transformed. So if we think back to the beginning of the 20th century, we had mass parties. And that party model, that has really declined. Mainstream parties have turned into what we call in political science cartel parties. So they've increasingly professionalized, they rely on state funding, use government power to cement their position. So as their membership has declined, they've hired more professional staff, spent more on campaigns, reduced their local presence. They've become centralized election machines rather than mass community organizing forces. And so these two dynamics together have been described as the hollowing out of democracy. On the one hand, citizens have withdrawn from parties, and on the other hand, party elites have withdrawn from society, relying more on the state for legitimacy and funding. So then how did political competition work in that context? Well, we're all really familiar with this because with the professionalization of political parties, we've seen policy moderation and a distinctive convergence of the center-right and the center-left on the center ground. And parties began to compete predominantly on governing competence. So they became more technocratic, and that focus made them appear responsible but not responsive. The credibility of these competence-focused approaches to politics was massively tarnished by successive crises. So the Great Recession, 2007-8, which in the euro area becomes the euro crisis, then the pandemic, and then the cost of living crisis. So let's just think about what that does to voters. For voters, these crises really accelerate, first of all, economic inequality, including intergenerational inequality, but also precarity. And that creates economic status threats, which are compounded by other challenges to old status hierarchies, social status hierarchies. And those other threats include immigration, which challenge ethnic and racial status hierarchies, and increasing equality between women and men, which challenge gender status hierarchies. So the radical right essentially focuses on mobilizing voter groups around these concerns. So radical right parties are typically defined by three core ideological features. One is radical conservatism, which goes beyond mainstream conservatism, rejects social pluralism, opposes gender equality, minority rights, cultural diversity, seeks to restore and defend prior hierarchical social orders that are seen as under threat. The second element of the radical right appeal is nativism. So they define the nation as belonging to a culturally, and sometimes in the case of the AFT, actually ethnically homogeneous native people, portraying immigrants, minorities, and also supranational identities and institutions like the EU as existential threats, justifying exclusionary policies in the name of national survival. And the third element then is authoritarianism. So in the name of the ethno-national people, they tend to favor authoritarian politics, viewing courts, rights, checks and balances, independent media, civil society organizations as obstacles to the popular will rather than democratic safeguards. So these parties were able to seize on the crises of mainstream democratic parties, and they've become these issue entrepreneurs, exactly as Jonathan explained. So they seize neglected issues, whether that's immigration, it's Europe, it's COVID, climate change, corruption, economic precarity, and they use these issues to mobilize disenchanted voters. They have learned to use social media and are really able to bypass traditional media filters and gatekeeping, and that is serving them exceptionally well now that most of us actually consume our news through digital sources and through algorithmically driven platforms. And they have invested, in many cases, in grassroots networks where the mainstream parties had withdrawn. Remember that cartelization, where mainstream parties withdrew from local organizing? Many of the populists go precisely into that gap. And the AfD has done that in East Germany. That's part of its success. And that makes mainstream parties who are not represented locally feel very distant and scripted. So in the wake of these crises, by the mid-2010s, the increased electoral volatility that we're seeing turns into earthquake elections in some European countries. In Italy in 2013, in France in 2017, but also in the other countries, we have sustained party system deinstitutionalization. So in Germany, the vote shares of the CDU and the SPD and the Greens have been shrinking and declining. In the UK, the vote shares and the polling of the Conservative Party, Labour, is in decline. So we're seeing party system deinstitutionalization, which means that in many European democracies, we're now in a profound crisis of mainstream democratic political representation. That's because the mainstream democratic parties seem as if they no longer listen, they don't seem to stand for anything, and they also seem to lack effectiveness and the competence to govern. And all of this has been compounded by two strategies that mainstream parties have tried to apply to meet this populist insurgency. One big strategy initially was to ignore or just oppose these populist parties. But that is a strategy that's not effective unless it's flanked with some form of renewal that addresses the deficiencies of the mainstream parties. Because if parties can't credibly promise to deliver more responsive or effective representation, then just opposing populism alone falls flat. The other strategy has been to copy or accommodate populists, and we see that a lot. That's, in a sense, at the moment, the favored strategy. Parties begin to imitate populist positions, especially on immigration or national identity. But all the research that we have shows that this backfires for the very simple reason that voters prefer the original to the copy, and populists essentially, they own that issue. It is the issue that they really have politicized and that they have built their credibility around. So copying populists legitimizes their agenda. And so the result is, in a sense, the parties that try to copy populists, they self-destruct. They self-destruct by essentially losing voters to other parties or facing a hostile takeover by their populist faction. So I'll conclude here and just say that thriving democracies do need parties that are committed to democratic principles. They are indispensable, but many of our democratic parties in Europe are in deep, deep crisis. And how we might get out of that, I hope we'll leave for discussion. Thank you.
Petra, thank you so much for that very, very rich discussion and really drawing together some very important elements. And one of the things going through my mind as well, when we advertised this, we talked particularly about the UK and Germany, was about the extent to which we can compare between these different cases. And I think your exposition of the factors leading to the success of some of these parties, even if the different manifestations may end up, being distinct, was really powerful. We've already got a couple of questions. Oh gosh, we've already got 4 questions in the chat, so that's very good. I'm going to bowl them to different people, but you may well, and I'll start with John, just to give Petra a quick break, but you are also very welcome to react to others. So one of the questions in the chat from Sebastian Elischer was about the notion of East German exceptionalism, and Sebastian wonders about the AfD gaining ground in the West. I think there is a really interesting question about whether there's something distinctive about Eastern Germany beyond its social composition. So people sometimes used to say, actually, if you pick a bit of Western Germany, which looks demographically like Eastern Germany. So, for example, where income levels or qualification levels might be lower, then you see similar patterns of voting behaviour. And we did see the AfD do quite well in some parts of North Rhine-Westphalia, for example, in their local elections last year. But then equally, people said, oh, and there's some bits of Eastern Germany that are doing quite well, and the AfD does worse there. But then it does seem to be something additional layered on top, which is Eastern. And so I wondered, John or Petra, if you've got any reflections on that. Question from Peter Hall, really interesting one about Sinn Féin and the AfD. Questions on that would be interesting, but I wonder actually you might want to broaden it into the internationalization of some of these movements as well. If it's not Sinn Féin, who are the key allies, and do you think that the kind of networks amongst right-wing populist parties are important? Sinn Féin would sit outside that framework, of course. Vladimir's asked about, actually very on that topic, about the influence of the US on this as well, and that feels very important and topical. Yeah, also global developments. I ran into a German politician earlier today, and he said he had the impression actually that the Trump administration was proving quite a curveball for the AfD. In fact, I understand that Alice Weidel was somewhat critical of Trump, and then immediately there was some sort of blowback from the US. So it'll be interesting to hear your reflections on all of those. John, we'll turn to you first, but Petra, you also have in a moment have an opportunity to respond. Please do keep the questions coming in the Q&A.
Thanks. Can I just address that last question from Vladimir Handel first, which is really interesting? Yeah, it puts the AfD at a tight spot. Obviously, you know, we saw the the bizarre Vital chat with Elon Musk back in the fall. There was obviously Trump's administration trying to support the AfD. We have the speech from Vance at the NATO Security Conference, and so forth. It wasn't clear to me really that the AfD benefited. I guess that's been a while. I can't remember when that was, but it was before the election, right? But it wasn't clear to me that the AfD really gained anything from that with increased vote share. But it is, for them, it is important to have that kind of legitimacy bestowed by the United States. And we have seen a number of AfD politicians now traveling to Washington to meet with members of the Trump administration on various things. So they love that. However, you know, Trump's agenda is not the AfD's agenda completely. And the latest example, of course, is Greenland. And the AfD is kind of stepping back from that and saying, well, no, we don't agree with this policy and so forth. So I think there are lots of points of friction between the AfD and the Trump administration, even if they welcome the support. So they have to play it very carefully about how they thread that needle. And especially because, you know, their voters may dislike a lot of the things that if the AfD becomes too close to Trump and the U.S. So I think there's that part of it. Do you want me to answer the first question and then turn that over to Petra after that? So the East German exceptionalism, I'd say there is still East German exceptionalism in the sense of voter behavior, because the AfD is getting vote totals in the East that does not get in the West. However, this rising share of the vote for the AfD in the Western states shows you that some of the issues and feelings and sentiments that the AfD taps into, just like Petra was talking about, are common across Germany. Okay, there are some things that are very specific to Eastern Germany, and it was interesting from Petra's remarks. You talk about the decline of voter attachments that we have seen across the Western world, these more free-floating voters without these long-standing attachments. And of course, in Eastern Germany, they had no voter attachments coming out of unification, so that it's been much more volatile in the East. The vacuum that the AfD fulfilled in the East was once occupied by the left party, by the Linke. We have to point that out. The Linke used to be the representative of East German interests. That has gradually been supplanted by the AfD, partially with help of the Linke once it expanded into the West and became an all-German radical left party. It lost some of its Eastern identity. So the AfD has been able to tap into that. So there's still the exceptionalism, but that doesn't mean that some of the AfD's messages don't resonate in the West, in Western Germany. They do.
And maybe I can chip in here and pick up on this last point that Jonathan made about the broader voter appeal of the AfD. So one of the really interesting things that we're seeing in Germany, but not just in Germany, is that in the last series of elections, we've seen the populist vote share go up in the youngest generation of voters, and that is new. So remember, throughout the post-war era, the youngest generation of voters was always and consistently the most progressive. And so we're seeing that change now, and populists actually making inroads in that youngest generation of voters. Even though, as Jonathan explained, there is a bit of a gender gap there, but they're gaining votes amongst men and young women. So that it's happening in both groups. And that is a really interesting and very important shift. And it tells you about which sorts of people are not being served by the competition of the established parties, who are really feeling left behind and who feel that there is really only hope in disrupting the system. So I heard this described in a really interesting way in Germany when I was in Berlin last year. And one person put this as, we're at a point where hope is switching sides. So post-war, essentially, if you were hoping for change, you could vote for a party somewhere in the established political system that was not going to disrupt and totally reject the system. Now, hope has is switching sides to populist parties that are ultimately competing on disrupting the political system entirely. And that is very important, and it's very important if that is the conclusion that the youngest generation of voters is coming to, because how you vote in the beginning of your life probably shapes how you will think about politics as you move through life. So this is probably not something that's going to change overnight or just going to go away. And I wanted to come to the questions about external influence and what is the role of the US or other populists here. And I think I'd like to broaden that point out beyond the US, although the US is, of course, an enormously important player here, but it's not the only one. So I think for a long time, we've seen that populist parties learn from each other, and they do create networks, and there's a lot of exchange. There's a lot of exchange on policy, on forms of competition, there's a lot of learning. And what we now see that, we have Trump in power is that there's one populist party that is able to use a lot of leverage, a lot of linkage, a lot of influence at all levels of international politics to promote what it sees as its potential friends and to demote the influence of what it sees as its potential enemies. And that's creating legitimizing structures, permission structures that are incredibly helpful for populists across Europe, I would say.
Petra, thanks very much indeed. That's really, really useful. There's another question in the chat. I'd also like, if I may, Petra, just to push you on one point we haven't touched on, but was encouraging the billing here, which is about the position of the UK in all of this. I guess one of the difficulties we've got is that there are always going to be points of national distinctiveness. So we talked about Eastern German exceptionalism for interest, and there are certainly some features of the UK's recent politics through Brexit, for example, which feel quite distinct. But I wonder about the extent to which you see reform fitting squarely within the framework that you've discussed, or whether there are any particular elements that sit outside it. The question from Rian Chilcott in a chat, it's a really interesting one, a party system one. I'll come to me first, Petra, and then back to John, see if you've got any reflections here, which wonders about the opportunity to, if people, mainstream parties, maybe leave government, they've got an opportunity to improve their local ground game. And that might work for some in Germany, Green, but definitely not for the FDP, and where you see that going. And maybe there's just a wider question about, and it stems from Petra's point about the sort of growing volatility and uncertainty in party systems. Can parties, through a good ground game, mitigate against that, or does that not really get them anywhere? So Petra, to you first, and do please keep the questions in the chat coming.
Yeah, super. Thank you so much. I mean, there are differences between a party like the AfD and Reform, and the AfD is different from many of the radical right parties in Europe in the sense that it has this very ethno-nationalist form of ethno-cultural form of nationalism. Sorry, so it's folkish in a sense, and explicitly commits to remigration, and it's openly hostile to liberal democratic norms in a way that we don't necessarily see in all other radical right parties. I would say Reform in the UK advances a much more sovereignist and civic nationalist project that doesn't share all of these characteristics, but there are some similarities too. It's sort of Reform is more about coercive immigration enforcement, border control. It's about deregulation. But, Reform is evolving rapidly at the moment. It is growing rapidly at the moment, and who knows where that's going to lead next. So there are important differences between these parties, I would say, as well as the similarities that I pointed out. The question about local organization, I think, is a really good one. And my sense is that local organization is going to be part of it, but not necessarily the way we knew it in the past. So parties do need to think about better and new ways of connecting with citizens. And when we look to the new parties, when we look to the digital native parties, there's a lot of really fruitful experimentation in this space with which, the big Volksparteien, the big established parties that have been around for 100 years and more have not experimented very much at all. And so there's been experimentation with multi-speed membership models, lowering barriers to participation, widening circles of supporters, such as giving people supporter status or having a registered sympathizer status or just online followers. So France's En Marche, for instance, has allowed free online registrations. There's, of course, a trade-off here, right? Do you keep these people engaged? Do you keep them? How close are they really? How meaningful is that supportership? But somehow thinking about how to broaden and how to connect with a broader range of voters is going to be important for parties. Investing in local party organizations will be part of that, and thinking about community organizing campaigns. Exactly how parties do that, they do that in very, very different ways. But so think about East Germany. In East Germany, the AfD is pretty much present everywhere locally, the CDU sometimes, the SPD and the Greens just not. How can you expect people to actually vote for parties when they're not even present in your community? And by the way, the Democrats in the US have the same problem. They've withdrawn from local organization in very many parts of the US. So that local organization is going to be important. Yeah.
Petra, thank you. It feels like a bit of a vicious circle as well. I remember recently talking to a young woman who was active in a mainstream party in Eastern Germany, and we're talking about doorstep campaigning, and she said, forget it, it's too dangerous, I can't do it. The radical right there, I just don't feel safe doing it. But of course, then if you do withdraw from those spheres, and if the only people present are those who embrace far-right values, then that ends up in quite a gloomy place. John, you may well have some reflections on that. I also wanted to bowl you one other question if I may. Which is you kind of about coalitions and about how that's going to work. So what you explained was that the AfD was doing better, and you'd end up with bigger and bigger multi-party coalitions in order to keep the AfD out of government. So you've already got an unusual coalition in Saxony-Anhalt, but eventually the CDU maybe has to break its firewall with the Left Party on a regional level in order to keep the AfD. So you end up with the CDU and the Left Party, as well as the Greens and the Liberals and the SPD and everybody else. And those coalitions probably won't work very well, and because they're so ill-aligned and difficult to manage. So it fuels political dissatisfaction, so the AfD profits. So that feels like a doom loop. Is there any way of stepping outside the doom loop? So any reflections you've got on the questions I just posed, Petra, would be great. I think she said anything on the doom loop. And then lastly, and Petra, I'll turn to you with this as well, Rob fishing for good news and asking about exceptions to the trend, Spain, Scandinavia, or Canada. John, over to you first.
Yeah, the doom loop. I mean, it's hard for me to see that there are that many good options for the mainstream parties. I mean, you correctly point out, Ed, that with these huge coalitions and unwieldy coalitions, that they probably won't get much done, and that might then further feed the AfD. Right. But on the other hand, you break the firewall, you have given up the game, because now you have legitimated, legitimated the party, at least to some extent, unless the union somehow pursues a strategy of go into a coalition, but do everything internally to undermine that coalition and make the AfD look bad. I mean, you could have that kind of strategy. But there aren't many good options here, except to do better at the next election. Let me go back also to a couple of things that Petra said, which I think are really important. Not only in local organization, as you correctly pointed out, Petra, the Democratic Party is not present in large. Well, in areas of the country where it didn't think it could compete, right? And so it put its energies and its money elsewhere. And I think that is the same kind of thing that has faced some German parties, because the AfD has had a very good ground game in Eastern Germany, especially. It's surprising to me that the Left Party wasn't more. Didn't take more initiative earlier on, because they really had the best ground game for the longest time in Eastern Germany. And yet they got outperformed, I think, by the AfD in this. And another point I think is brought out by the question is not only, and also by Petra's remarks, is that not only is it the local ground game, but there's got to be something, the burnishing of the message, because I think a lot of voters, the reason that it might be attractive to young voters, the far right to young voters, is because the established parties just do not have much pizzazz. They don't have much pizzazz to them. They look very bland vanilla. And if people are looking for a fundamental alternative, they might go to a party like the AfD. Of course, the kind of flip side of this, besides the kind of campaigning, is the actual performance. And I think that is crucially important now in Germany. And I said this right after the election results came in, and it was clear what we were going to get with the coalition, is that Merz is on a short time frame. He has to get things done, because if he doesn't get things done, more and more voters will drift away. So competence is a big thing for mainstream parties. They have to accomplish things as well as burnishing their message. And we know in the United States, if we can come back to that, we know there's a lot of dissatisfaction with Trump, a lot of dissatisfaction. But at the same time, a lot of those people who are dissatisfied with Trump, for them, the Democratic Party brand is bad, and they will not turn to the Democrats. So, the opportunity is there for the mainstream parties to use. Not that there are a lot of always easy choices, but they have to try to rebrand themselves as well as organize better to attract those voters again who are clearly dissatisfied with Trump and the Republican Party.
Maybe
John, thanks very much.
Yeah. Sorry.
Petra, over to you.
Great. Well, maybe I can jump in here and try to get out of the doom loop a little bit and come to Rob's question. I mean, he asks, what about the exceptions to the trend, Spain, Scandinavia, or where I am, Canada? What, if anything, can be learned? So, I mean, in Canada, Carney has been enormously helped by Trump. But I think what I would say with the examples where we do see this bucking of the populist trend is that when governments buck it, they deliver in precisely the way that Jonathan actually outlined just now, and they communicate well. So both of these things are really important. And delivery in today's environment is really, really difficult. I think we really shouldn't underestimate that. So we've got globalized economies. We feel that every day with every tariff threat. We've got climate crisis, we've got demographic change. This all makes policy results slow and contested. This is really difficult. But the solution, I think, lies in communicating realism and a degree of long-term purpose, and not to run after everything that you're being chucked. And this is the problem of the Labour government currently, right? Because I think voters do forgive difficulty, but they don't forgive deceit, and they do see through over-promising, which is Merz's problem, actually. And I think delivery does mean, you have to have a bit of courage to be transparent about the problems, to signal a clear sense of direction, and to be clear that there are just no quick fixes, and maybe sometimes be prepared to actually consult about a choice a bit more than maybe traditional politicians have done that in the past. But I think, yeah, delivery and better communication, better narratives are part of this. And we do see that actually the communication part we see really well illustrated, when some of the hyper popular candidates like Zohran Mamdani kind of cut through. Yeah, so the communication does matter.
Terrific, thank you. We've only got a few minutes left. Maybe one area we've not touched on, which I might just briefly ask about, is about the role, we have touched on it, but we haven't explored it, is around the role of social media and their, I suppose, their ownership. You mentioned, Petra, in your earlier comments about sort of algorithm-driven exposure to views which might become more extreme. I mean, increasingly there are conversations about the ownership and regulation of social media. You can well see how there'll be quite strong pushback against that. I mean, does that offer anything, or do you think that's a red herring?
So, I mean, my 2 cents on this is parties still need to learn to communicate in a digital environment. And too many of the mainstream democratic parties are just not able to do it well. And that's shocking. That's really shocking. So that is one task. And no matter what happens to our digital environment, they'll have to learn to do that. But on the other hand, especially those parties in government do have the opportunity to think about regulatory reform. And I think Europe needs to think very carefully about regulatory reform. In a sense, the digital environment is part of our public service infrastructure. We can't have democracies. We can't have deliberation. We can't make up our minds if we don't have reliable information that we can go to. And countering disinformation, supporting a pluralistic media ecosystem, these are democratic responsibilities. And we do need to think as European nations about how we want to do this. As you say, Ed, this is going to invite some backlash. And that'll be difficult, but this may be a fight that we need to have.
Thank you. I'll bring John back in. Any reflections on that or anything else? Then Petra, I'll hand you the last word if there are any things you'd like to say in closing the discussion. John.
We don't have too much to add here. I mean, I agree generally that the mainstream parties have to get better with digital communication. I would warn that we can overestimate a little bit the role of social media in actually impacting the vote. I'm not sure how much of a role it played in 2025 in the federal election. I mean, it's still, I would still say it's more important to communicate a message and have that a message that can resonate with voters. That doesn't mean you have to be, too creative in the digital space. I think it just means that you have to have a strong message that people can take away, and again, that you do things, that you get some things done at the end of the day.
Brilliant. That's really interesting how you both sort of coalesced on the points about doing politics well, whether that's in communication or delivery, and without that leaving areas exposed. Petra, do you have any final thoughts on any of this?
No.
Brilliant. Well, colleagues, we promised we'd finish on time. We're going to wrap up a moment early. Finally, in wrapping things up, first of all, huge thanks to the British German Association for hosting this. The BGA is a wonderful organisation, so if you're not a member, but you're interested in British German friendship, then I know they'd really, really welcome it. And the way the BGA's kind of revived itself and become ever more active, and indeed hosts events like this, is truly terrific. The International Association for the Study of German Politics, if you're interested in German politics, particularly if you work in that space, also really welcomes new members and new involvements, and we'll even let you on our mailing list for free. Please do get involved. Been a really great discussion, and above all, I'd like to thank Jonathan and Petra for what they've said. We've covered a huge amount of ground, from party systems through coalitions, recent history, the picture cross-nationally, international links, policy choices, strategy, links with kind of local activism, the grassroots, social media. How we did that in less than an hour, I do not know. So thank you very much indeed for your time, and thank you to our audience for absolutely brilliant questions, which really, really oiled the wheels of discussion. So thanks, everyone, and I wish you a lovely evening. And I think it's now going to be drawn to a close, but thank you all.
Thank you, Ed and Petra. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be part of it.